Welcome back to Axis and Arc, the youth-led podcast from the MEA Institute for Strategic Studies. Today, we're talking about the African Union's 38th Summit in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, which this year focused on justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations. Our team recently wrote a policy paper for the African Union Commission. It tackles one of colonialism's longest shadows, the theft of African cultural heritage. During the colonial era, thousands of sacred and ceremonial objects were taken from communities and holy sites and shipped off to European museums and private collections. Most of them are still there, locked away, thousands of miles from the people and the places that they belong to. Our paper digs into specific case studies, looking at what happened to these objects and the ongoing fights to bring them home. I want to be upfront about where I'm coming from. I'm a white researcher educated in the West, but our team was anything but one-dimensional. We're young people from all over the world, including colleagues reporting across Africa. That mix of perspectives shaped how we approached this work, always trying to center African and diaspora voices and keep it grounded in lived experience. Because too often, the story has been told from a Western lens. And when that happens, it's easy to lose sight of the harm and to forget that cultural dispossession isn't just about losing things. It's about losing memory, identity, and sovereignty.
I mean, we come from a continent of great wealth, but a continent that has been assaulted and abused very often. And exploited.
Yes. Yeah.
And so oftentimes what colonialism did is that it rewrote our history and, changed our narrative. And so our narrative, our global narrative is one of poverty and strife. And the wealth of the continent is very seldom seen on such a global scale.
Yeah. That was Lupita Nyong'o, a Kenyan-Mexican actress, filmmaker, and author, and an advocate for reclaiming African cultural heritage. Before we even started writing, we talked to artists, activists, and community leaders, people living with the legacies of these losses. One of them was Peterson Kemwathi, a contemporary artist from Nairobi whose work dives deep into social and political realities.
Just to cut my ramble, I remembered one of the things I constantly reference is George Kadara, he's a Kenyan. I think he's, once making an example of the level of destruction that comes on the back of the looting of objects, And in the analogy he was making, he said, imagine waking up one morning, I think I might have told you so when you met. You wake up one morning and your cup is not there. Your bed is not there. Your seat is not there. Your door is not there. The windows is not there. The knife that you'd use to, for example, cut and, in the kitchen is not there. Or the spear that you'd use to go and hunt an animal so that you can feed for sustenance, is not there. Or maybe even the farm implement that you could use to go and till the land is not there. So how far back does that set you, or what level of destruction will that wreak? Not only to yourself directly, but also those who depend on you and who might also come after you.
That image stuck with us. It's a simple way of explaining what it means to have the essentials of your cultural life taken away from you and why repair is so important. As historian Sylvia Sellers Garcia writes, systems can make this kind of loss feel so normal that we stop even seeing it as violence. And as Patrick Wolfe said, settler colonialism isn't an event, it's a structure. The logic that took these objects is still in play today. Our paper is not just about the past, it's about imagining a different future, one where African heritage isn't sitting in European storage rooms, but back where it belongs, alive in the cultural, spiritual, and economic life of its communities. Today on Axis and Arc, we're joined by Genevieve Labuschagne, co-director of Integrated Intelligence and the Space, Cyber, and Seaboard program at MEA's Intelligence Desk. Genevieve also served as a lead coordinator of the African Union Reparations Project, helping shape policy at the intersection of cultural heritage, justice, and geopolitics. Born and raised in South Africa, she brings a sharp regional lens and a systems-level approach to some of the most pressing challenges facing the continent today. Happy to have you, Genevieve.
I am so happy to be on the podcast today and be engaging with our little passion project. I say little, but it was a big work of joy for the Institute, and we're really proud of what we produced.
My first question today is what motivated your team to approach reparations through this lens of cultural heritage and art, especially as a youth-led think tank?
Well, it's important to recognize that reparations are not only about righting historical wrongs. It involves challenging and rectifying colonial legacies. And what's integral to that is taking back ownership. So when we look at colonial legacies and the forceful removal of African artifacts, it's not only a physical loss, it's the loss of the ownership of historical narratives and identity. And cultural heritage and art are both so crucial to that ownership of identity. We cannot challenge the hegemonic Western narrative of Africa's history and identity if we cannot first reclaim our own history. And that's a sentiment that really stood out amongst the team. And I think as a youth-led think tank, it's our youth that drives so much of our sentiment, and this is no exclusion. At the crux of it, the easiest way to say it would be that we want our history, our culture, our story to be heard, not the story written about us by others.
I wanted to bring in a point that I really liked from the paper, actually. One of the quotes that really stuck out to me was, returning these items is not merely about restoring physical artifacts, it's a recognition of historical injustices and a symbolic act of healing. So, yeah, thank you for those points. I totally agree. I felt the same working alongside this group on this project. We also interviewed an artist, Peterson Kamwathi, about some of his ideas on how to integrate restitution in a way that works locally, because oftentimes a lot of these institutions, they kind of come in and give a top-down approach, which I think doesn't always work. And as we've seen, we'll probably talk about it more later on in this podcast, but we're looking to kind of bridge the gap between, as you've said, these academic institutions and what's happening locally. So that leads me into my next question, is we're really focused here at MEA on bridging policy and community. So this paper really aimed to bridge that gap between academic institutions and on-the-ground realities. I'm wondering, why is civil society and local research so essential to successful restitution? And how did MEA build these partnerships?
Well, another core sentiment that we really brought through when we were doing our brainstorming sessions was sustainability. And there cannot be creation of sustainability without looking at who needs to be sustained by this. As you mentioned, there's so often this top level down approach. And time again, we've proven that it's not what is needed, is not what sustainability necessitates. The grassroots approach, it's an approach that I really strongly believe in. I believe that, it's one ripple in this area has the power just to ripple beyond and beyond. And it's something that we did feel throughout the whole brainstorming and interactive process with all the team members. Sustainability really came to the forefront. And a big part of that was to look at how the local reality, how civil society plays a role in that, and to build those partnerships. We created a team that was able to draw from such various areas of expertise and also just engagement of where they are. We had people for example, from South Africa, which is myself, and the teammates just coming from all over the place, you from overseas, all of that, bridging all these different views. I mean, you did a fantastic interview with an artist that so much that came from that resonated from us. And, we looked at selected case studies, the Algeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, Namibia situation, and we saw that context plays such a role, but Africa isn't homogenous. It's complex, it's diverse, multifaceted. culturally distinct. So that creates such unique challenges when it comes to both reflecting the continent's diversity, but also creating an approach that is successful and future focused and sustainable when it's dealing with reparations, because it is difficult and it can't just be a group of thinkers and experts right at the top, because what has been stolen, what has been taken, what it has left, the impact, that is felt most strongly on the ground. And that's why we really wanted to push through from that perspective.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'm wondering, from what you just said, what do you think are some of the major challenges of trying to create an integrated approach across Africa while respecting and honoring the diversity?
You know, it's a big question to ask because there is no straightforward solution. It's something that it requires a lot of thinking. It requires a lot of aspects to it, a lot of understanding. You know, everybody says Africa, they say African, they think of it as this one, country, but it's not. It's a continent, and more than that, the countries that we see outlined on Africa, those are also legacies of colonial rule. They are arbitrary borders that were just scratched up on a piece of paper, a map by colonial powers who decided to designate certain areas. And that in itself has very much defined Africa to both, well, to its detriment in some cases. I mean, you have areas where ethnic groups, where languages, where communities were separated by borders, divisions, because of these decisions made by colonial powers. And a lot of that means that a sense of identity amongst certain people was split. And now you have to foster a completely new identity, which is based on national unity. Here in South Africa, specifically, we have 12 official languages, which correlate very closely to communities, to people's identities. And for example, we have a group of speakers in the country called the Tswanas. That is also the main language of Botswana, but it's also an entire group here. So we see there that there's a lot of shared, that's a shared language. There's not even a universal language across, the continent. It's not like going to Europe where you're almost guaranteed that most people are going to be able to speak one of the major languages there. So English or German or French. You come to Africa and the languages are so distinct. You've got countries with so many different languages. I mean, South Africa with 12 in its own is such an amazing thing to be able to navigate, but it's really complex. And I think what happens is, if we look at the dominant transitional justice models that we see playing out in the global north, there tends to be a lean towards individualized legal remedies. And that does play a role in understanding context, but I don't see it as a sustainable process. And why I don't see it like that is because when we curate these individualized solutions to every specific case or context, that's when it can become quite time consuming, perhaps nitty gritty, so back and forth. So, that's a big part of the challenges is, how do we balance recognizing the individuals, not just the countries, but the individual communities that have been affected, that are actively involved, that are the recipients of these reparation and restitution efforts. How do we balance that with trying to create a institutionalized, forward-looking reparations regime that we can embed in the continent, and in terms of creating a continental framework of law and practice for this? So it is complex, and once again, I recognize there's no quick solution, but it's a challenge that we took on headstrong and tried to deal with it as best we could.
Thank you so much for that. And I think you raise a really good point. And something I wanted to bring up as well is that, you've mentioned there's so many different ethnic groups and these arbitrary borders that were drawn during colonialism created conflicts. And I think that one of the reasons that European powers are saying that they shouldn't return art is because of those ethnic conflicts, a lot of them that were caused by Europeans. So I think that's something that's interesting to consider when we're looking at the reasons that European powers are not currently returning art and some of the legal loopholes that they're using in order to not allow justice to be served. I think it is very interesting to look at specifically those legal terminology that they're using. And that kind of brings me to another point. The paper addresses the need to counter European colonial narratives such as the civilizing mission or Europe's burden, which promoted the idea of Africans' inability to value their own art. I was wondering if you could kind of expand a little bit more on these terms, what they mean, and how that's been used to legitimize European powers not returning art.
Well, I think it's an argument that rests so much on this hegemonic Western narrative of Africa. This idea that it's somewhere that doesn't have those facilities. You can't return it. It's not going to get taken care of. It's not safe. And these are ideas pushed out by countries that don't want to return, that have this narrative, this idea of a continent which isn't what's on the ground. Coming back to why we want that on the ground perspective, why we want it from the bottom up, is because it's so easy for certain narratives to be pushed about the countries and the continent that it is incapable to provide adequate care or protection or, just in general facilitate the art and artifacts. And that's not the case. That's not what the on the ground is. You can't judge continents based off of only one type of discourse about it. As a South African, I've been to our National Gallery, I've been to our National Museum. I have been to so many institutions that focus on arts and cultural heritage and all of that stuff, and we have those facilities. I mean, we have foreigners, we have tourists that come through to come see this. So the idea that what belongs to us cannot be returned because we don't have the facilities for it, it's a narrative that they hide behind. And while some people might have legitimate concerns about that, because we might not have things that are state of the art, because at the end of the day, there's not the same facilitation for that. What we wanted to do with this policy was to also engage with that and to find a way to counter that argument, because a lot of reparations, it's not just the legal loopholes, it's your terminology as well. It's this idea of what is an adequate institution or infrastructure to take care of this. And, it's easy to hide behind that and say, oh no, this artwork's going to get damaged. But I don't want to say proof, because we do not owe anybody proof of what we can do with what belongs to us, but to invest in what we know will be best for taking back ownership of what belongs to us. That's a big part of it. And we did look at that in creating the Endowment Fund, which was the main policy proposal that we presented in this paper.
Here's something worth your time if you want to keep up with policy and what's driving change. Strategic Insights is MEA's free newsletter for emerging leaders and professionals who want to stay informed about the trends shaping diplomacy, security, and innovation in the Middle East and Africa. Each edition offers clear analysis and practical takeaways to help you cut through the noise and engage more deeply with the issues that matter. Just hit the link in our show notes or find us on LinkedIn at Strategic Insights by MEA. Thanks for tuning in, and now let's return to the conversation. So one point that you just brought up that I thought was really excellent was this idea that European powers claim that Africans cannot preserve or maintain their art, and that's used as kind of an excuse to not return cultural artifacts. I saw this in the case of Algeria in the case study that I was looking at. There were human remains that the French said that they could not return because they said that Algerians wouldn't know how to take care of it or preserve it correctly, and they could be preserved and maintained better in French museums. In reality, those bones were actually just sitting in the bottom of a basement of the Museum of Mankind in cardboard boxes. But I wanted to bring up that point because I think it's critical to the kind of the rhetoric that European powers are using to legitimize not returning these artifacts, and not even artifacts, but literally human remains, like people's ancestors sitting in a cardboard box. And I think that reveals so much about current power dynamics. And even though it's a small case, it expands, and you can see so much in this one case. And I think to direct it back to a question, I'm thinking, how did the team see like preserving and maintaining art within Africa according to Africans rather than according to Europeans?
I'm really glad that you brought that point up, because the first thing that just jumps to mind, and I think it's important to actually mention this and bring this. One of our colleagues really strongly presented this, and I think it's so important because it might just be something that nobody thinks about or hasn't actively thought to question as much, is the art and the artifacts that were taken that are being displayed or kept in the archives of European infrastructure, their museums, their galleries, and so forth. Those items are dictated as art by those colonial powers, by those individuals, by those governments. If we look at the Algeria situation, you have to ask yourself, what does a museum want with a collection of bones, of the remains left of people who walked the earth, who lost their lives? What is it that makes that art? Because, there are very, very limited instances that I know of in Europe where you can walk into a museum, and I definitely know you can't walk into a museum and see Marie Antoinette's bones just plastered on a wall. And I think it brings back that question that one of our colleagues really brought to the brainstorming sessions about how the things that we are fighting to get back that were taken from us, a lot of it wasn't created to be art to begin with. A lot of it was meant to not be seen or were performative, or, a lot of acts were sacred. These were sacred items that were not supposed to be viewed, were not supposed to be shared. So the idea of what is considered art and what isn't art was dictated by someone else. And now it's the dictation of how that should be preserved, displayed, presented according to the same Western hegemonic powers that decided what that art was. And that was a part of the conversation we had to ask. And we have to also recognize, do we depart from this being art and, saying, okay, this was never supposed to actually be art, let's return it to where it belongs? Or do we engage with, okay, this has been dictated at art and it is valuable to our history, and displaying it or preserving it, so forth, is part of our identity, our ownership, and rewriting the historical narratives. So it's complex. And once again, that also plays a role in the idea that we might not have the infrastructure to maintain that. Because I think the first question comes in is, how do we choose to display what is us to begin with? How do we choose or choose not to display what is being returned to us? And I think in this moment, when I say being returned to us, what we are having returned to us, not what someone else is deciding to give back to us, but what we as a continent, as countries, are taking back. It's not, I don't want to fall into the trap of that typical idea of, oh, but they're giving it back, but they're not. We are demanding it back. We are taking back ownership of ourselves. And by taking back that ownership, so we get to choose how we want to display and how we want to interact or not display the artifacts and the cultural heritage that belongs to us.
Thank you so much for that great point. And I really just want to draw out something that you said that I thought was really critical is just this idea, the label of what is art is power. I think that's so interesting, and especially with the case of Algeria, I thought it was so fascinating how the French government claimed when they're able to claim that the bones were art, they were also able to claim that they had ownership over the bones because anything that exists in French museums is technically national property. So they actually had ownership over these bones. So my question is what are some of the ways that you could see these cultural artifacts being taken back, used in communities in ways that stray away from Western museums and this concept of preservation that is, deemed universal and deemed to be the only way that we can preserve and maintain artifacts, but in reality is just a tool to, legitimize the ownership of these artifacts, which are not European. Yeah, do you have any examples or ideas about this specifically?
I think the most direct, most important way to go about it is to do the due diligence and to ask those who are most impacted by this work of art where it comes from, this artifact deemed art, where it's been taken from, who's been most impacted from, what their stance is on it. Because at the end of the day, it may be something of great value because it's now being declared art. But if you go back to the community that it was taken from, you need to ask them what their input on it. You need active participation at the grassroots, because if a community, a family turns around and says, actually, we don't want our ancestors' bones on display, who are we to say, but we need to recognize that not everything that was taken has to be displayed. And if it is to be displayed, it does not have to be in the normative notions that are outlined in the global north. We ask the questions of how was this artifact used, created? What did it mean when it was created during, before it was taken, its purpose? So we look at that and we say, we need to align it with that because, it might be a vase, but was the vase always supposed to carry water, or was it used for something else? We can't display it carrying water if that wasn't what it was used for. I know that might be a very simplistic analogy, but it's that same question of we don't get to dictate how something should be used without first looking at what and how and for who it was created, taking accountability for that, taking knowledge. Because in that, we're doing what needs to be done. We're giving ownership back to the people who lost what belonged to them. We are redefining narrative. Just because it's a vase to someone doesn't mean that that's what it was created to be or what it is. We're not listening to the history written about us anymore. We're giving it back for the story to be written by the people who are the story. And I think there might be so many potential solutions and ideas and contradictions and disagreements about how to do it. But for me, I personally just believe that it starts by looking at the context, the reality of it, and talking to the people on the ground.
Thank you for that. And I wanted to move forward to specifically discuss the endowment fund section of this proposal. This was a really, really exciting piece of our project to me because it really comes forth with some very tangible policy solutions. And I think it's just so exciting. So it's essentially our paper is proposing this AU endowment fund that would address the restitution gap. And our paper says that this would be through clear, measurable objectives. So I wanted to ask you, what is this fund and how would it pursue these objectives?
So reflecting back to how I mentioned that sustainability was core for this policy creation, as simply and hopefully as eloquently as I can put it, the AU Endowment Fund is what we hope to be a permanent investment fund that is established through the African Union, which will be used to finance the reparation of stolen African cultural artifacts and art. We want to use it to build a sustainable long-term income that is created through investment of the member states, donors, stakeholders, those involved. And additionally, we take a portion, whatever that may be decided on, from the returns, and we put it towards supporting restitution efforts and the objectives that we have outlined. So essentially, we want to envision and create a self-sustaining framework. And to do that, we focused on core objectives, and to ensure that we could be accountable to those, we suggested certain goals, measurability, because it's great to have these objectives, but we need to know how we can measure whether these are being implemented. So one of the first objectives we presented was the documentation of stolen artworks. And we wanted to be able to fund the research and the creation of inventories across African member states. And to measure that, it would be something along the lines of, cataloging a decided percentage of the looted collections by, for example, 2030. We proposed 2030 into our policy paper. We wanted to facilitate something that supports legal claims. So, providing the grants for provenance and the research and covering the legal fees so that we can undertake these projects. Setting aside a portion of the fund for a fixed number of restitution cases each year was and is a measurable variable that we want to use. Also, we found it important that the fund enables negotiations and acquisitions. So where needed, to provide the platform for the diplomatic efforts, the travel, the purchases, all of these other aspects that are involved, that facilitating of essentially the administrative challenges that come along with these efforts. And two objectives which really embody so much of what we wanted with this policy was, the first was to build return-ready institutions. So that definitely to counteract that narrative of, Africa doesn't have the facilities for these artifacts. And to do that is to invest in either upgrading or even creating museums or facilities and archives that can house the returned artifacts. And that includes whether just keeping them protected, safe, or choosing to display them, depending on how the decisions are made after appropriately consulting the relevant individuals. So, it's easy to measure that in terms of, saying we're going to improve a set number of specific institutions within a time frame, for example, 5 years. And then, of course, what was so crucial is that we want to raise public awareness. We want active participation of all African communities, artists, stakeholders, and that can involve a number of things: sponsoring exhibitions, campaigns, publishing regular progress reports. Important to show that what the fund means to do, they are doing. I mean, great ideas for that would be to host an annual symposium and release, let's say, 2 reports per year, and openly invite people to engage with it, not have this as a secretive or closed institution, something that has active participation. It's how to ensure these objectives. It also rests so much on the accountability and governance that is used in this institution. And to do this, we presented the idea of the fund being independent whilst being affiliated with the African Union, and that it should be managed by a diverse board of stakeholders. So from that, we're talking African Union officials, civil society, experts, and experts from historians, archaeologists, legal experts, subject matter experts, NGOs, everybody that has a stake in this, everyone that sees the future of this, the importance of this collective collaboration. And, at the end of the day, we need our checks and balances. We were trying to be as pragmatic as we can to really have set regulation standards that could turn this policy idea into something that's implemented on the ground. And we propose things along the round of transparent financial reporting, which is crucial, independent audits, public updates to track progress, keeping this as open book, as measurable, as clean and transparent as possible. That's what we wanted to do. And the interaction between all of those factors is how we were able to come up with an idea that we believe does provide clear, measurable objectives that can be used to address restitution gaps.
Well, thank you so much for that. Something I really wanted to draw out from what you just said was the sustainability aspect of this endowment fund. As we've seen currently within the case studies that we were looking at, a lot of the return of art is actually kind of fed by civil society pressure, and it's kind of a one-off occurrence, and it takes a lot of lobbying and political pressure in order to get these returns to happen. And that's just not sustainable long term. It's not going to foster actual justice or healing, especially because a lot of these returns become these kind of political symbolic acts. They're like these empty gestures rather than an actual effort to contribute to healing. So I really liked that aspect of the fund particularly. So thank you for that. I also wanted to ask specifically, you mentioned a vast array of people kind of contributing to this fund and the ideas of how this restitution return would look. So I was really interested in specifically what roles you could see for youth, artists, and diaspora communities in making this fund work beyond just a symbolic gesture that we've seen in the past.
Well, the fund is aimed at becoming a platform that moves from the performative to the implementable. And, I keep hammering on the sustainability aspect because it is so, so crucial. And, it was something that just was so prevalent in our discussions. And, the fund would essentially provide the long-term financial and institutional support for restitution efforts by funding provenance research, legal claims, negotiations, acquisitions, public awareness, skills development, education, these are all aspects that are needed to strengthen the cultural infrastructure in African countries. And by involving youth, artists, communities, those who are actually impacted, that is very cool to the fund. These groups of people, for lack of better wording, are the customers of the service. They are who are supposed to be on the receiving end of these efforts. And as such, that involves us giving them the power to hold reparation and restitution accountable, that gives them how to hold us accountable, because active involvement through inviting active participation, that's when accountability is created. That's what's needed. So the role I see for all these communities that are impacted, and the role I always see for youth, is the role of accountability, of active participation. We are not shying away from the fact that for us, the long-term sustainability of this project, it needs to be directed beyond just the fact that we are taking back, that we are engaging with cultural restitution, reparations. We have envisioned that this is going to have an impact on future generations. And those who are most important are the youth in many ways, and are the artists and all the communities involved. So, at the end of the day, that's who we need to be held accountable to. And that is the role that we see for the communities most impacted. That's the role we see for them in making this fund work, is to hold the fund accountable.
Completely, I agree. So moving on to kind of our final takeaways for this podcast, I'm wondering, what's one thing that you want listeners to take away from this episode, especially those who might see policy as out of reach or reserved for experts?
Well, there's no quick or easy solution to the challenges of reparations and restitutions. Policy is a tool, and it's the tool that's used to get from point A to point B by presenting a potential route. And as well thought out and put together or aspirational as a policy could or wants to be, the proof is in the pudding. So implementation is where the proof of a policy is. And it's understandable that new ideas or policy propositions, they do generate reservations. But I think what needs to be taken from this discussion and this policy paper itself is that cultural restitution is a long-term commitment, and it needs to be Africa-led. It needs to be sustainable, and it needs to be future-focused. I think, and I strongly believe, the restitution efforts don't end at the return point. What follows the return and those reparations is as if not more valuable. And that's why the fund aims to invest in Africa, in the youth, the artists, the communities. That is the focus, and that's what I really feel needs to be taken away from this discussion.
Thank you so much, Genevieve. I really appreciate your insights today. I'm so excited to see where this policy paper goes. And, a huge thank you to everyone at MEA for all of the incredible work that they've done on this. It feels so wonderful to be a part of something so powerful, so moving. And I really appreciate all of your support discussing this. Thank you for listening to Axis and Arc, a production of the MEA Institute for Strategic Studies. At MEA, we're committed to fresh perspectives and practical insights on diplomacy, security, and innovation across the Middle East and Africa. If you enjoyed this conversation, please follow, rate, and share this podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to our Strategic Insights newsletter for more analysis straight to your inbox. You can find all the details and more ways to connect with us in the show notes. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged.